Okay, so Blindsided did ultimately end up being your first published novel,
Yes.
even though you had worked your way through these sort of practice books.
Yes, 3 or 4 actually.
Well, you know, you're absolutely right, and you're certainly not the first author I've spoken to who has written what turn out to be more or less practice books. In fact, there are some authors I've spoken to who wish they'd burned them because, you know, now that they're famous, everybody would like to go back and
Right.
look at those. And I wonder if it's probably too late for me, but I've often wondered if I'd had the character to do that. You know, if I wrote one and it really was not up to snuff, if I then wrote another one, if I'd have the nerve to get rid of it.
I've talked to my agent about that because she said, you know, I really love this story. Let's see about getting it published with this next contract. And I said, I'd really want to rewrite it. And actually, when I got my book deal, I rewrote Blindsided because I was a different person. I had written it 2 years before, and I was a different writer. I was getting closer to my 30s, which I think, especially for a woman, is a really big transition. And, you know, I was just looking at things differently, and it's certainly a lot darker than the first Blindsided.
Is it?
Yeah, a lot darker, and I'm really pleased with it. But if anyone was interested in those other novels, I'd want to spend some serious time rewriting it.
Yes, it's such an interesting question. As an editor, I got a manuscript from an author who's published several books with a major New York house, and I really love the concept, always liked the writing. Really love the concept for this book, but it just didn't do it justice. It was a much better idea than the execution. And with some trepidation, had a meeting and said, you know, love it, but it's just not ready to publish. It's going to have to be reworked and so forth. And I was very pleased when the revision came in. There was a note attached that said, thank you for not publishing my book the way it was. And, you know, I wonder how many people actually are disserved, if there's such a word. It is a disservice, I guess I could say, to some authors to let something out that probably should be reworked or should, you know, should be digested.
Editing to me is the most important part of what I do. I always think of the manuscript they published of the first Great Gatsby, back when it was the Something of West Egg was the original title, and Max Perkins, Fitzgerald's editor, said, you know, first let's get rid of the title. Let's make this a mystery. Let's do different points of view. Let's do this, this, and this. Totally changed the manuscript around, you know, and here Fitzgerald, this great American writer, delivered this manuscript thinking, oh, you're going to love it, and Perkins just ripped it apart. And I think that's important because writers can't get perspective on their own work. There's no way you can do it. Somebody asked me if I could have one wish, what would it be? And it would be to be able to edit my own work the way I would edit someone else's.
But you can't. I
Yeah,
mean, that's an
it's
oxymoron.
hard.
You just cannot. I find that writers oftentimes not only can't edit their own work, but can't really appraise what is their best work. I mean,
Oh, yeah,
the world is
definitely.
strewn with authors who, my own favorite, Georgette Hare, for example, who wrote glorious Regency novels and just sort of wrote them, slapped them off, and thought they were fun. And well, it's not fair to say she slapped them off. She did tremendous work. But anyway, she thought they were sort of light fiction. What she really was good at was this historical novel. And her historical novels are terrible. They just creak. And the Regency ones are the ones that live. So sometimes it's the unself-conscious writing, I wonder, if that...
Definitely. I felt that way with Kiss Cut. Blindsided is very visceral, and Kiss Cut's more psychological. It's certainly darker. And a lot of times when I was writing, I didn't feel like I was actually reading what I was writing. It was more like it was just coming out. And I wasn't sure at all whether or not it was good. And my agent called me on a weekend and said she'd just read the first 100 pages and she was blown away.
I like it. I like Blindsided, but I thought Kiss Cut was a really extraordinary book. I like it much better.
Well, I want to get better with each book, so hopefully when you get Faint Cold Fear the Third, you'll say, this is better than Kiss Cut.
Well, you know, Karen, part of the deal, don't forget, is that different stories work for different people. See, I think a writer has to write the story, you know, that he or she wants to tell at any particular moment. But the reader, some readers will respond to that and some not. There will certainly be people who disagree with me and prefer Blindsided and not like Kiss Cut. So, you know, you've got to do what you want to do, and then I get to read it, you know, and evaluate it my way. And I think it probably is hard for a writer to run into a reader who is like their work and then maybe rejects a book, or just doesn't seem very high on it. And, you know, I think that the writer needs to give the reader the freedom to like or not like the story, in the same way the reader needs to respect the writer's desire to try different things and write. You know, it's the whole body of work, really, in the end. It's kind of hard at book two for us to have a serious discussion about the whole body of your work. But let's think about, you know, 10 years from now, and presumably there have been more novels. The critical question is not that I like book A, B, or C, but, you know, how do I feel about the body of the work and the entries within it? You know, they may not all impact me the same.
Right. Oh, I agree. And I have friends who actually don't like graphic books, and so they certainly weren't drawn to mine, and they probably only read it because I wrote it. And I said to Lauren Henderson, as a perfect example, I said, you know, Lauren, I know that you don't really like graphic stuff, so if this is going to bother you, I understand. You don't have to read it. And she read it, and she said this was very graphic, and you know, I understand how it appeals to different people.
Sure. I've described Kiskut as not for the faint-hearted.
Yes.
And I think that's a fair description. I also think I have a slight moral obligation as a bookseller to kind of, you know, warn. I mean, you know, it's not like our rating or whatever it is, but if I do think there are people who may truly be surprised or shocked, I always feel like it's fair to give them like a little gentle hint, you know, maybe this one's pretty visceral, or, you know, explicit sex, or whatever it is that you might, you know, need to say, not as a pejorative, but just so that you don't wind up with an offended reader.
Oh, I
mean,
agree.
you don't want
Definitely.
an offended reader. I certainly don't want an offended customer. So, you know, yeah, I mean, and that can be even for something as innocuous as when Ken Follett wrote Pillars of the Earth. I felt, you know, I never sold a copy of it without saying to people, it's wonderful writing. If you're a Ken Follett fan, you know, you're going to love it. But be aware it's about building a 13th century cathedral. It's not, you know, one of Ken Follett's patented World War II, whatever thrillers, because there were going to be people who were really going to be disappointed, even if they might like it. That wasn't going to work for them somehow. Well, anyway, I wanted to ask you about your medical background. Clearly, in order to write Sarah convincingly as a coroner, you have introduced a lot of medical technology, terminology, whatever, into the books. Where's that come from?
Mostly my reading. I went to mini medical school at Emory. I think I told you that last year, and I can't practice medicine, but I got a T-shirt. And I've always been fascinated by medicine. If I could do the math, I would probably be in medical school now. It's something I enjoy reading about. I read textbooks, and you know, just on top of that, I have 2 friends who are doctors who vet my text and make sure this makes sense. But even among doctors, you know, you can't get a real consensus. Some of them, one will say, well, Sarah would never do this, and the other one would say, I do this all the time, Sarah would do this. So I have to sort of pick and choose what helps the story. And I do the same thing with the police aspect. I have a friend who's the chief of police in one of our towns near where I grew up, and she goes through it, and I ask her procedural questions to make sure I'm getting everything right. But in the end, I try to pick what will help propel the story, and try to be honest about the sort of medicine or the procedure that's going on, and know the rules before I break them.
Sure. Well, the telling detail, as in historical fiction, you really can't completely swamp your reader with medical technicalities or you'll lose them. So, you know, going to medical school could actually handicap you. You might end up knowing too much and not be able to get out of your own way.
Yeah.
It may be that you can write it well because since you're not completely into it, you know, you are aware of how to make your reader, bring your reader along.
Right,
Your reader
and I think I
understand
bring my fascination with the whole thing to my books too, because I want to know about it, and I try to get that spirit of let's find out what's happening into my books. But Lindsay Davis is good. You mentioned historical fiction. I love the Falco series, and she's great about doing all this research, and you know she goes everywhere to find out everything that's happening, but she puts it in the text in such a way that you don't feel like you're being preached to.
Now, well, she likes the anachronism of having, you know, what's essentially a modern gumshoe working in ancient Rome. Very different from Stephen Saylor, who's seriously historical. And I love both their books. I'm hugely fond of both of them, but they do come from a very different basis.